You on?
Okay. Okay.
Good
You're a
morning,
little bit
everybody.
glitchy on me.
Good morning, everybody. Glory to Jesus Christ. Glory forever. Happy Saturday morning. That's where it is in my world. And I've got a real treat for us this morning. I've got Dr. Carrie Frost, PhD, adjunct professor and lecturer of theology, and good friend. And we're going to talk about hesychasm and the Jesus prayer and whether those things should be kept in monasteries and the variations over time about how the church has felt about lay people doing it and why. So that makes it sound very dull. It's not going to be dull. But before we get there, how about if we actually get there through some prayer? So we'll do what we always do. We'll do 1 minute of the Jesus prayer together using the square breathing. Okay, ready? Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Last time together today. Breathe in slowly. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God. Pause. Breathe out slowly. Have mercy on me, a sinner. Pause. Okay, let's resume our normal breathing. Don't want to leave you there holding your breath or something like that. So here I am, and there's my porch right next to me. And let me bring on the main attraction, Dr. Carrie Frost. They can see you now. Good to see you.
Good morning.
So where and when are you?
So I am with you from Bellingham, Washington State. I'm not on my porch because it is pitch dark here and raining. But I thought about it.
Because it's the great Northwest.
It's the Great Northwest. However, I want to point a few things out, one of which is right now I can hear snow geese migrating above my house. There have been like huge flocks of them over the last 24 hours. And so I can hear outside my window the noises of them as they fly. And one thing I do enjoy about your program is I enjoy the bird noise because I'm a big bird watcher. And so it's been fun for me to hear the birds of the South that don't live here, right, on your show. And today, just for anyone out there who's a bird watcher, it's the global big day. This is a big day where people go out and they bird watch. So people who go out and they note what they see, they count, how many robins they see or chickadees or snow geese or whatever. Yeah.
That is so cool. I didn't even know that. I didn't know that about
Yeah.
you. I didn't know that about the world. I mean, I'm familiar with the Mutual UFO Network, right, where people watch the skies and no idea about the birds. So you may be interested. I'm inside now, so it's harder to hear our chickens and hear all the Georgia birds. But inside, right here, we've got a parakeet right behind my screen, and we've got a lovebird, and we've got, I think a parakeet. And then we got like a cockatiel or something upstairs. So,
Fun. Yeah,
yeah.
we have two zebra finches. Those are our inside birds.
And I was never into birds or anything. And what did it for me was go into the Holy Land and visiting the monasteries. And so many of the monasteries there had just huge, what are they called? Apiaries or something like that, places for birds. And along with their gardens, right? So you would be in this pretty austere area, and then you'd walk through their courtyard, and you were back in Eden, as it were. And I thought, oh, there's something there. And then my kids
Right.
are so into the birds. I mean, I think if it's possible, they have watched every YouTube video about birds and chickens. And some of them are ridiculous.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the neat things about living in Georgia, rural Georgia, is that the high school offers a whole series on agriculture and
Right.
horticulture and birds and stuff like that. So, you know, that's not something that we got when we were living in the suburbs of Allentown or, you know, Rhode Island. It's it's really kind of cool. And,
That's,
you know, my kids were
yeah.
dubious, I'm sure, at first. Oh my goodness, what are we going to study? Dirt, right? And the teacher is awesome for one. She just loves the kids, loves the world, and shares that, right? So pretty cool.
That's super cool. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is something I tell my kids all the time with the younger kids, with the triplets. We bird watch all the time together. They are really into it, and it's just a joyful thing to do with them, and like a really interesting thing to do as a family unit, as a foursome, and something that we learn about together. And like right now, actually, I'm homeschooling them this year because we just decided that was going to be a better route for us than to do remote. Schools here are remote anyway,
Yeah.
so we just figured that was going to be better for us. And so we, the four of us, they're 12 years old now, and the four of us are taking an ornithology bird biology class for their biology class of seventh grade. Like that's what we decided to do. And so for all of us together to be basically on the same level, I have not taken a science class, for many years. It's humbling. And to be a co-learner with my children is a great thing for all of us. It's just a great thing to do together.
Yeah. Oh, on so many levels. And they get to see how you learn, right? And
Yes.
how you deal with frustration maybe sometimes
Yes.
when you're
Yes.
learning humility, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just quipping to a friend because I'm not going to school with my kids, but we're all in school together because we're all online learning from home. Not a big house. And, you know, I'm back in a PhD program and I'm taking advanced statistics. And that's not the way that my mind is wired. And it's so hard for me. And so I was joking with a friend that I'm learning humility poorly and slowly. Right?
Right.
Oh, it's crazy. Yeah, so you're homeschooling your triplet 12-year-olds. That's beautiful.
Yes, it is. That's great.
And is your teaching, is that all online?
It is. So I'm teaching at the university, at the Western Washington University right now, and that's all online too. Um,
And
so,
what are you teaching?
so I'm teaching two classes right now. I'm teaching an introduction to the study of religion, which I've taught that several times now, which I really enjoy. And then I'm teaching a new class. I'm teaching a meditation, mindfulness, and religion class, and which definitely relates to what we're going to talk about today. And that class looks at several things, contemplation in a big sense, but then also the mindfulness movement as it exists in America today and its Buddhist roots. And then there's also a section on the Jesus prayer in that class, and its history, its practice today. I wanted my students to have an experience of a contemplative tradition other than the very secularized mindfulness tradition and its Buddhist history as well.
Beautiful. And we're
So
gonna
my
get we're gonna get to that,
great
but
class.
I want to catch up on something else first. So, intro to religion, right? This is so cool, right? Because your PhD is in religion, not just Orthodox theology, right? And it's so interesting when you think about it, y'all. How, if you were going to teach students in a secular world about religion, how would you do it at a secular university, right? When the concept of awe, like obviously for me, I just showed my cards, right? The concept of awe is behind so much of the religious experience. Very difficult to describe, right? So, do you have a common theme that you're trying to present? Is it an experiential class, or is it just not just, but are you focusing mainly on these are the world religions, commonalities, differences?
Well, so the way my department structures this class is very interesting.
Ah, okay.
Um, it's a case study class.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
That's so
so
impressive. Much better. Because teaching a survey class can be kind of drudgery. Because here you are, you're in love with the subject, and you can't
yeah,
really present, the love doesn't come through
yeah,
necessarily.
yeah. So I love this way of doing it. And right now, actually, in this class, I just started a section on beauty and iconography in the Eastern Christian tradition. So that's one of the sections that I'm teaching. And this is the first time in this class I have decided to teach that. So we'll see how that goes. I'm really curious to see what that's like because this is new material for literally every person in this class. No one has a background in the Christian East in this particular group of students. So I'm very curious to see what they make of it.
Oh, that's awesome. I got to teach, Father Basil of blessed memory. That was his course at seminary, was the course basically on beauty. And then I got to inherit it for a couple of years until we got, a real person in. And it was just so much fun introducing, doing theology in a way that's real, right? And I use someone, he's out there on the West Coast too, David Clayton, who's a Roman Catholic and also Byzantine. He's getting more and more interested in Byzantine Catholicism. But he's an artist and a theologian that if you haven't met him, just keep him on your radar. I think his book is, the book that I used as a textbook for our course was The Way of Beauty. And the reason I did it is because my students were from Ukraine mostly for some of the courses. And so they're not familiar with Western concepts of beauty except through the lens of orthodoxy, which is often uncharitable, right? And so to say, no, this is how a serious Western theologian understands art and religious art and iconography and so on. And so, I wasn't trying to sell anything, but you can't talk to Westerners through that lens. Or else, if you just want to drive them away or get them to come in through self-loathing or something like that, which we can do. We can certainly do.
Right.
But anyways, this second course on contemplation,
Mm-hmm.
what an awesome opportunity. Wow. So did you know that would be a course that you might be teaching when you applied or when you began your conversations for teaching at the university?
Well, when I applied to teach there, they asked me for classes I would like to teach, for ideas about classes I would like to teach. And that was one of the classes that I proposed, that I tossed out there. And the department chair at the time just loved the idea. And so as soon as there was an opening to teach a class, she said, now is the time, you need to do it now.
Wow.
And so when the course listings actually went up for courses, it filled right up. It was full within 24 hours. And so it's just been great. And my students, everyone in this class is there for some sort of reason. They have some sort of reason to be there, right? This was a very self-selecting population that signed up for this class. And it's going really well. And it's just fantastically interesting material. It's something that, I should just preface this, I think, with my interest in this actually.
Yes,
So,
please.
yeah. So a few things, one, Tibetan Buddhist studies. So as an undergraduate, that's what I studied at the University of Virginia in the religion department. So I grew up in the church. I grew up as an Orthodox Christian. I grew up in a Carpatho Russian parish. And I went to the University of Virginia, and then to my parents' total confusion, studied Tibetan Buddhism. And the reasons I did that were that it was just so fascinating. It was so fascinating to me. It was so compelling to me to go and study something so completely different from what I had grown up in. And for me, it was absolutely formative to look at a completely different tradition. I spent time in Tibet, I spent time in China, I spent time in Nepal, and to go and watch the ritual life, to learn about the contemplative life of a different tradition, gave me a totally different lens through which to view my own. And really, as a young person too, it also made me personally just really appreciate my ancestral, spiritual gift of orthodoxy, and be able to embrace it personally in a new way that I don't know if I would have quite been able to do at a young age. It was just very personally rich for me, and theology, ethics, and culture in a religious studies department, as you alluded to. So I have both this training in the study of religion and also theology, but was so specific to Orthodox theology in my PhD. So my point here really is that I have both this academic training and in Tibetan Buddhism as well as Orthodox theology. And I also have practiced the Jesus prayer, which is not to say I'm an expert, definitely not an expert. But I have this long time interest in these two contemplative paths and how they are in some ways parallel, but also very different. And then what's been so interesting to me is to watch, especially over the last 2 decades, the mindfulness movement here in the United States just totally blossom. And emerge out of Buddhism, and become secularized and become so incredibly popular, and then move into all these other spheres, like move into public schools and move into these other places, and then have people ask me, have lots of Orthodox Christians say to me, are these mindfulness practices compatible with Orthodox practices, or are they not, or how are they, and just have all these questions. So that's kind of where, I'm coming from, both personally and professionally. And lots of questions, for me as a scholar and as a person, things like, as human beings, are these practices of contemplation, are things like contemplation and silence, are they critical to who we are as a species? Are they totally elemental to who we are? Are they necessary for human flourishing, for example? And then really specific questions to our own tradition, like the practice of hesychasm and the Jesus prayer in particular, just looking at the history of it and the monastic practice, but then the lay practice, why don't we as lay people practice this more? Why isn't this a more broadly practiced thing in our lay culture of our church? So just to give you a broad picture of where I'm coming from.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, right. Yeah, this is, so as a grown-up Christian in America, I had no idea that the West or the East or Christianity in general had this kind of contemplative tradition, right? And then, so that was one of the things as I got interested in Orthodoxy that my eyes were open to, along with the saints and councils and stuff like that. And one of the first 10 books that the group that catechized me with gave me was A Monk of Mount Athos about St. Silouan, right? Which is all about the contemplative practice and pitfalls and rewards and things like that. And, and it was funny. I look back, so of course, what did I do? This is America, right? I bought a prayer rope. And of course, did I buy, a 33 one that goes around? No. I bought a 100 one, a 100 knot one, because I couldn't find a 300 knot one, right?
Right.
and I just, and just walking around, I did a lot of walking. That's one of my main contemplative practices. And just, the Jesus prayer. No, not trying for anything, just saying, okay, well, this, the way of the pilgrim, he did it while he was walking. I'll do it while I'm walking. And yeah, brought some peace, but at kind of a superficial level, right? And then later on, when I became a priest, and then I started teaching at seminary, I've read a lot of books, and they needed somebody to teach spirituality. I'm like, yeah, sure, I can do that. Why not? I'm a teacher. And I'm like, oh, if I'm going to teach this, I probably better take my spiritual life just a wee bit more seriously, right? And so, like you were saying, it's not just about books. This is either real or it's not. And if it's not real, then all the books in the world are just, so much fantasy, science fiction. Maybe we'll be talking about magic, right? But to find that there is, to know, not just through reading, but through experience, that there is something meaningful that happens in the process of contemplation that is, it's real. It's something that human beings across time and places and traditions have found, right? I mean, as far as I know, there's no group that kept records that doesn't have some form of spiritual contemplation. Now, it may not be ideal, like some of them involve drugs and stuff, like the vision walking of ayahuasca or something like that. But there's something there. So this question, and we've got so much I want to talk to you about. I wish we could have 5 conversations at once, right? So this idea of it being, I don't know if it's essential, but in terms of human flourishing, I know through my experience that when I know peace, and that's the one time where, that's what you're about. It's not dependent on circumstances. That I'm better, that I'm more able to deal with stuff. I'm a better pastor. I'm a better person, father, everything. So for me, at least, it is a necessary part for my human flourishing. If I don't have that, I have to medicate with something else, right? So what does that mean? If that's generalizable, and look, this is an ego world, so I'm going to generalize and say yes, this is something that most human beings most of the time will find useful. What does it mean that we're not cultivating that as a culture? Sorry, here in America. In fact, we're doing the opposite. We are doing our best to damage people's ability to sit in silence.
Well, let's point a few things out. Okay, so first of all, we can go back into the desert. We can go back into the Egyptian desert, and we can see that even then, those contemplatives were struggling with the fragmentation of the mind, right? They also had these problems. They also struggled with the passions. They also struggled with the scattered nature of the thoughts. So I want to just make sure that we acknowledge that some of these problems are not exclusively contemporary,
Beautiful.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that today there are unique pressures on us in our modern life. I do. And things, that are super fragmentary, possibilities for our consciousness. I do. And I think this is part of the reason that the mindfulness practices have been extracted from Buddhism so quickly and so successfully secularized and widespread and mainstreamed. And just a little comment about that, which is that, when religions go to different cultures, they change and they morph and they adapt and they interact with their host culture and so forth. Like this is just a, historical reality, right? Over time and space and the history of the world. But what we've seen happen with this phenomena of the mindfulness movement in America, and it's happening in other places too, but the mindfulness movement's primary home is America. is we've seen this happen at this incredibly rapid pace. So we've seen it speed up. We've seen it just speed up. So this extraction of these practices from their Buddhist origins and this, movement of them from a religious context to a secular context is just so quick. And I think that's really noteworthy and important for any discussion of this. But I think one of the reasons why this is the case, there's several. There's a commercialization aspect and some other things too. But one of them is to address the contemporary pressures upon human beings, and a real well-intentioned desire to do that.
And I wouldn't necessarily put those two against each other. I mean, commercialization has its own problems, but the market in itself is about people getting things that other people need to them, right? So if there is an honestly felt need for something health, peace, quiet, then entrepreneurs are going to say, hey, I found this thing. I think other people would like it too, and they'll provide it. And like you said, then the culture comes in and recontextualizes it, right? And one of the things that the market in America does is it makes it more vanilla. Okay, fine. But I don't think it would look vanilla. It looks vanilla to us because this is who we are, right? What is the difference? And then we're going to do this with Orthodox hesychasm, right? What is the difference between the way that, someone in the mountains, the Eastern mountains, would experience the, Buddhism in Tibet, for example, versus the way that you'd get it if you went to a secular gym in America?
Right. So I think there's several, there's a lot of things, but I'm going to give you what I think are the critical differences. Several things have happened in this transition between Buddhism and mindfulness, in the mainstreaming process. One of them that I think is really important is that the monastic context has been left behind. And this is really obvious, right? But it's really important. Buddhism is an incredibly monastic tradition. The monasteries are where all the theology happens, all the education happens, where the political power is, where the social teachings happen, etc. Monasteries are where things go on. And in particular, where lineages get passed on and where any sort of theological lineage or meditation technique and these sorts of things are passed from person to person. And so when the mindfulness movement emerges out of Buddhism, all the monastic context is left behind. The mindfulness movement is entirely a lay movement. And this is huge. This is an enormous social change and for so many reasons, right? Mm-hmm.
So Kerry, most of us, we hear those words, and I understand there's a difference between lay people and monastics,
right,
but may not have really a feel for that. Whereas, if you visited and spent time in a monastery, like a Tibetan monastery, then you see the rhythms, even as an outsider. And what? So for us, maybe, the data that we have when you say monasticism is groups of celibate men or celibate women with their, waking up and chanting and eating and studying.
Right.
That's not capturing what you're trying to get at, though, what you're telling us.
Well, that's certainly some of it.
Okay.
And let's just hone in on that a little bit more, because in most of the Buddhist monastic context, there are nuns for sure, but largely male. So let's refine that, and have mostly a male monastic picture in our heads. But what I want to highlight here is that this is a life of renunciation. This is a life of people leaving the world. This is a life of people leaving their families, leaving all those ties. This is a life of people eating the same thing. This is a life of people doing the same thing every day, going to bed at the same time, waking up at the same time, not making individual decisions, having a communal obligation, not having possessions, like just a radically different life from a mindfulness life in America, where people are, are lay people in the sense that they're not monastics. They have no obligation to a community like that. They're living what we would consider sort of a normal American life. They have jobs, they have family ties, they make individual choices about their lives. They have work, they have children to pick up from school every day. They eat what they want, they go to bed when they want, they buy what they want, they have possessions, they have all these ties to the world. There's not an obligation of renunciation. They're not these kind of things. So like a completely different daily life, right? And a completely different relationship with the world. And so that means that what is valued in terms of the practices themselves completely shifts. So in a, Buddhist monastic context, the goal for all these meditation practices is nirvana. The goal is enlightenment. The goal is a cessation of rebirth and reincarnation, and a hope that one would reach a realization of the emptiness of all things, and a detachment from all relationships and a detachment from the world. So in contrast, the lay American mindfulness movement is going to be like an embrace of one's relationships with clarity and presence and, clear-mindedness, an embrace of the body, an embrace of these attachments, an embrace of how to navigate them with, peace and calm and relaxation. Lots of different goals, really. I mean, there can be all sorts of reasons that people go into the mindfulness movement. It can be everything from relaxation to hoping to have lower blood pressure, to greater well-being, to less anxiety, right? All sorts of things like this. But more of navigating the sort of daily life of the world rather than leaving the daily life of the world. So these are very, very different everyday parts of the practice, but a different telos, a very different telos of what's going on.
Yeah, so this is going to be kind of random, so this is just a little footnote, but I'm almost finished listening to Rod Dreyer's new book, Live Not by Lies, right, which is a look at dissidence and seeing what we can learn for how to live in our society. And one of the things that he talks about is the changing telos, the different telos, right? That ours is therapeutic and it is self-centered. And that matters. That affects the way that we do religion. It affects the way that we do mindfulness here. So that sounds like a critical variable. And I don't know if you would describe it this way, but one of the parts of that, to me, as someone who is, don't tell me what to do. Right? I mean, I've got that strong American individualism, right? The idea of complete submission to, a plan, an order, very difficult, right? I've been through the army. I'm an Orthodox priest, and I'm all in. I get it, but I know myself, and so I have to recognize that my experience of prayer is going to be of a different quality than someone who has kind of renounced self and renounced ties and things. So what does that conversation look like between real Tibetan Buddhists and people who are practicing, meditation, Buddhism light, or whatever? I'm sure there's a conversation that goes on.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. That's been something that's been so interesting for me to follow and watch. And I don't practice mindfulness and I'm not a Buddhist, so I can't speak from either perspective, right, personally. But to observe people who are and to watch their interactions, different people have different reactions. There are some people in the Buddhist tradition who appreciate what has happened in the mindfulness movement because they feel that it has made Buddhism, especially the way that the mindfulness movement has brought an air of scientific legitimacy to some of these practices, because now they've been studied and they've been shown to have health benefits. They've been shown in many studies to reduce anxiety or reduce blood pressure, and there's various studies about these sorts of things. And so there's a way that Buddhism is now perceived to be sort of compatible with, reason or science or sort of the modern era and these things, and not to be kind of an irrational, outdated religion of, the Dark Ages and the way that like some contemporary people perceive of religion in general to be. And so there are some Buddhists who feel that mindfulness has kind of given Buddhism like this credibility almost, or like this legitimacy as a tradition. So that's like a really interesting thing, right? A couple other things are, one is that there's been a big effect in Buddhism, like the mindfulness movement has had all these repercussions back into Buddhism. One is that much of Buddhist practice has actually not been about seated silent meditation. Yes, that has been part of certain aspects and traditions of Buddhist practice, but that has largely traditionally been reserved for particular monastic lineages. But the mindfulness movement has now popularized that within certain Buddhist traditions. And so you're now seeing like Buddhist temples build meditation spaces that, usually would not have had that, and usually would have been more ritualistic, like lighting incense and doing prostrations and moving through ritual space and doing other things with their, kind of ritual time. So that's interesting that now, certain Buddhist traditions are having their own, spending some of their own time doing mindfulness meditation, like integrating that into their own tradition in a new way. I do know Buddhist practitioners who feel that this is watering down their tradition and feel that they have a really robust telos. They have a really robust theology of nirvana, a really robust theology of practice, a really robust understanding of what these meditation practices are meant to lead them to over time, and how to understand enlightenment and how to detach from the world, and that these mindfulness practices are leading people away from that, and that it's a disservice to their tradition, and are highly critical, and feel that that there's so much to be gained from like the richness and integrity of their tradition. And so they speak out in that way. So lots of reactions, right?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. It's just so interesting.
It is. Yeah, it is. Okay, so now we're trying to go on the journey the way that you did, right? Orthodox, exploring Tibetan monasticism, an outsider. And then now you've spent time looking at the tradition of hesychasm within the church over time, right? Different times, different places. The attitude towards lay involvement in hesychasm has varied. When you read books like the Philokalia, St. John of the Ladder, Ladder of Divine Ascent, it's there. It's clear that this is a serious part of monastic tradition, and that may be varied over time, right? But within the Ukrainian tradition, St. Paisi Velikovsky, that's one of the things that he did, is he brought this back. We say to the church, but to the monasteries, and then books like The Way of the Pilgrim showed that it had, more of a following there. But in general, what is this variation in attitude towards lay use of hesychasm? Because sometimes it is seen as a charism of the church that is meant for the church, the body. At other times, it's treated more as, this is a special sacrament for monastics under obedience, right? This is a special kind of, I almost said Gnostic. That's not fair. It's more reserved, right? Can you talk about that variation for us?
Right. So this is such a point of fascination for me, because I do think there are mixed messages. But what's so interesting to me is if we really look at the tradition over time, I think what is actually consistent is there's a pretty universal message coming from the monastic tradition that this is a universal practice that's available to everyone in the church. I see that as the underlying and consistent message over time, even if that's not always embraced, right? So when we see the Jesus prayer as something, especially the Jesus prayer itself, I would say, we have the bigger tradition of hesychasm, but I would say the Jesus prayer itself, when we see it emerge as a really recognizable form in the 5th or 6th century, in places like Greece and Gaza, we, at that same time that it emerges from people like Barsanuphius and John and Diodicus, at the same time, we hear them saying, this is something that is available to everyone, it's being recommended in personal letters of spiritual guidance from Barsanuphius and John to their lay people that they give advice to use this repetitive prayer of Jesus help me, or Jesus calling on the name Lord Jesus, as a lay practice. So there's this, like from the very beginning, that this this prayer is emerging in the church. It is recommended to lay people. And we can trace this thread, I think, all along. Gregory Palamas, even in his, intense debates about energies and essence and so forth, which are, it's a monastic conversation mostly. Even he takes the time to say that this prayer, praying without ceasing, is something all Christians should do. Like, he takes the time to say this is a universal, affirm that this is a universal practice. And then I think the Philokalia is so interesting because often, I hear it often characterized as something that's intended for a monastic audience. But when we take the time to really look at it, the introduction to it by Nicodemus, he in that introduction says that this is for the general benefit of all Orthodox and all who share the Orthodox calling, monks and laity alike. I mean, those are his words. Are that this is who this is aimed at. So it's just a point of fascination for me, actually, that, we do have these mixed messages, but there is this like consistent and like really persistent message from these sources that we consider to be the capstone sources in our tradition, that this is a universal practice available to everyone. Yeah. And I think the way of a pilgrim is especially, go ahead. Do you want to interject?
Yeah, let's come to the way of the pilgrim in a moment. So I'm not surprised, right? It's kind of the way I'm wired, but I'm not surprised that it would be universal because it matches our physiology, right? The fact that, this deep breathing of kind of checking out, laying aside all earthly cares, right? And just being in awe of God it works with our wiring in a way that's beneficial. So, as I was saying before, even a secular society is going to develop something. If it's healthy, it's going to develop something that takes advantage of that physiology. It's going to tap into that wiring because it's so much a part of our health. And the church responds to us in our bodies, right? In our bodies. And there would have to be, I could imagine there being, oh yes, but it's not hesychasm. That's the monastic thing. What you're doing is this. Okay, fine. You want to have different words? I'm okay with that. Here's what I'm doing when I'm doing silent prayer. No noetic visions, none of that. It's just quiet in the awe of God. In fact, anything that I see or I hear is a distraction that I'm kind of pushing away, right? I'm just being peaceful in the presence of God. Now, there's one of the ways that I'd like to go if we have the time after you finish up your thought on or present your thought on the way of the pilgrim, is how this gets tied into the authority structure of the church, right? Because one of the things that I sometimes hear is kind of a fear, for one, that somebody might get hurt, right? Because there are stories of saints that were led astray by visions. And then another that plays in, I've been studying and meditating on the authoritarian personality, right? And the desire to control. And this really is one of those things that, as a pastor, I have to have some trust in the people that I'm guiding if I'm recommending that they spend time doing the Jesus prayer. And, you know, not every not every pastor, not every priest, not every monastic elder is comfortable with that kind of complexity and with that kind of trust. In fact, what we see in the Orthodox way is often to say, no, all of the sacramental experiences of God are going to be mediated by the priest. You know, so if you want to get into that, please do. But what were you going to say about the way of the pilgrim?
Sure. Well, what I was going to say about the way of the pilgrim is that it is such an interesting text for us in this monastic lay relationship of hesychasm, and in particular the Jesus prayer, for a few reasons. You know, we think of it as a spiritual memoir because it's certainly presented that way, but we know it to be a composite work. You know, it's a work of several monastics' texts being combined together. And that we don't need to be shocked by this or have it, I think, take away from any of our spiritual interaction with this text, because monastics wrote this way. You know, they did not want to have any sort of, individual acclaim for their work. They often wrote anonymously. They often wrote in a composite way. So, you know, this is a perfectly fine way for monastics in our tradition to write, is to write anonymously and in a composite way. So, and it may well have been based on people's personal experience and combined in an authentic way. But I think what it tells us, the fact that it's a composite text written by different monastic authors and put together, is that it was so intentional. It was so intentional as a way for monastics to very deliberately offer again the Jesus prayer and its practice to lay people. I mean, this was a way for the monastics that put this together to say, here it is. You know, here it is. Here's this affirmation of a lay person taking this practice and running with it. Here's a how-to. Here's an inspirational guide of this practice being used by a lay person with the support of a monastic community, of course, right, with the guidance and support. But this was a huge popularization moment, right, in the history of these practices, was the way of a pilgrim. And then I think actually with really fascinating, possibly untold consequences, just given how that text has been translated over time and how it's been a very popular text outside of the Orthodox Church, how that text is beloved as like a spiritual classic, you know, well beyond the bounds of our church in really, I think, interesting ways. Yes. So I think the way to jump into this question of like authority is to say that pretty much every time, you know, I've just made this argument that this is a universal practice and it's been affirmed so consistently throughout our church's tradition. But then the thing I need to note is to say that it's affirmed, but there's always kind of a condition. There's always a way that it's like, yes, this is a universal practice. However, people should always be doing it in a community. However, people should always be doing it with a spiritual guide. However, people should always be doing it in the life of the church. So we hear this in different ways from different authors and in different contexts. Like Nicodemus in his introduction to the Philokalia, he expresses some concern that people might do it without a spiritual guide. And he says, if you do it without a spiritual guide, then please do it with humility and with the Holy Spirit. You know, so there's always this like kind of plan B, right? If you don't have a spiritual elder to be with you. And then Paisi Velikoski, when he translated the Philokalia into Slavonic, he had a lot of concern about lay use. He had a lot of concern about laity taking these practices and using them outside of a liturgical context. That was his concern. And that, like you said, that there would be spiritual risk, you know, that people could be spiritually damaged. And I'm sure, and several other authors say this too, and I'm sure they say this based on, like you said, you know, real experience, right, of seeing people experience spiritual damage. And this is a possibility. We all know this to be true. People can be spiritually damaged. They can be spiritually damaged inside and outside of the church. This is a reality. And so I think that was a heartfelt, intentioned concern that he had. But he ultimately believed that it was best to go ahead and release this translation of his, that it was for the greater good, right? To go ahead and translate it and have it published. And so there's this tradition of people who are introducing these different texts or writing about the Jesus prayer to always say, yes, it is a universal practice. However, do it with someone or do it in the context of the life of the church. Metropolitan Callisto Swear, and one of the times that he writes about it, he says to do it with a soul friend, which I thought was such an interesting expression because he's not saying an elder, but he's saying more with a companion, with a peer. And I think this is so important, actually, because what's so interesting to me about the mindfulness movement, and I think this is something we can really learn from, actually, and it touches on something we were saying earlier, is a criticism of the Buddhist. One of the Buddhist criticisms of the mindfulness movement is that within the mindfulness movement, you can be entirely individualistic. You can focus entirely on the individual. It can be all about you and your own concerns and your own desires. It's entirely possible to just completely separate from any community and any other greater social ethos or anything else. And one of the real downsides there is that stress can be totally privatized today. We can create this idea that all the problems are in our mind, right? And that we can, if that's the case, it's our obligation to fix everything in our own mind. And then we have no obligation to fix any social ills around us or work together to better our communities or our nation or whatever. But what these different conditions or the sort of wariness about the Jesus practice or hesychasm being extracted from a community practice does is it safeguards that. I mean, it does many things, but it safeguards that. It means that if we are doing these practices in community, with an elder, with a community, with a soul friend, we are always doing them in this personal relationship. We always have this obligation to another person. We always have communication happening, and we avoid a temptation, I think, of them becoming like super individualistic practices that are just about me and that become a privatized practice that takes away any sort of social ethos or obligation. So to me, that seems a really important actually aspect of this way that the Jesus prayer gets talked about over time, and the way there is this conditional, kind of release of the monastic community to say, yes, it's universal. However, always do it, in the context of the church and with other human beings. Right. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, I love introducing people to things that will bring them closer to God, that will bring them closer to their neighbor, to peace. And the Jesus prayer and silent prayer in general is one of those things. And as a pastor, I'm not a starets. I'm not one of these. I'm not going to be a shaman that is able to take somebody into that direct relationship, but I'll be there to encourage them, to support them in their struggle. And, if they do go sideways, if things do go sideways, that's part of the conversation as well, right? And so I think rather than trying to foster within the groups that I lead, the parish and, with seminarians, rather than trying to figure out how to be that starets to them, unrealistic. And none of the institutions are set up to support it. So the only thing that would support it would be my ego and my desire for control, or ability to control. So rather, there has to be a lay model, right, for parishes. And it can't be based on fear. It's where you describe, look, these are the risks, these are the things to look for. Do it in humility. Here are the signs that your pride has taken over, right? Oh, and then so you have that conversation in confession. And if I have cultivated a relationship of trust with the people that I'm pastoring, that's going to be a natural part of the conversation anyways. You know, not my prayers are very dry, or my imagination is telling me things. And so I think we have to be realistic, and it's not oh well, you can't have the monastic, the real version. So we'll have this consolation prize. It's not like that, right? But rather, it's a way, along with all of parish life and family life, it's a way of baptizing the whole thing and recognizing that this is our path. This is our path to know God and to know our neighbor. It's not the monastic path, but and if we confuse those things, then we're going to get all kinds of wrapped up, right? If I try to create monastic expectations and relations in a parish, not sustainable. It's gonna hurt people. It may help people in the short term. I don't know. But that's one of my concerns as a, sorry, I ranted a little bit, but that's one of my concerns as a seminary professor, is to watch for that and to make sure that our spiritual guides, men and women, are understanding about their limitations and what their role is in helping people to know God and to know their neighbor. And you can't hear that because Kerry was practicing hesychasm with her nod.
Father, I would like to know from you what, if I may ask a question,
Yeah.
What you hear from other people about how the Jesus prayer is being practiced. What you know of other priests or other parishes or other communities. Just sort of what your knowledge is of the Jesus prayer in parish or community or lay practice.
I think that what it is when you introduce somebody to it, or you're talking to somebody about it, many people have positive experiences of it. Almost no one has a negative, except, oh, it didn't do anything for me, right? Of the people who are willing to speak honestly about it. Here's what I don't hear a lot of is, oh yeah, that's a regular part of my day. So it's like with meditation in general, in the secular world. I know a lot of people who have found short-term benefit when they're dealing with something, right? Through deep breathing and, stuff like that. But it's not a regular part of their routine. It's more of a therapeutic, something they'll prescribe, self-prescribe, which is certainly better than nothing because they know that God is always with us. He's always available. If you go into the silence of your heart in prayer, you can be in the presence of God as you can with your neighbor. But that's the most striking thing for me, is how reluctant we are to make silence a regular part of our routine.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're getting mixed signals from priests, but I don't know about that. I think I don't see a lot of that. So I don't see a lot of scare talk coming from priests saying, oh, you shouldn't do that, or only do this, only talk to me about it, or something like that. I really don't see much of that, except if I'm trying to look for it in the literature, right, or on websites or something. I think with the people that I know, the priests that I know, they have a healthy attitude towards it. They have the understanding that you shared, that this is a universal gift that needs to be done in humility. Mm-hmm. And if you do it in humility, the rewards are awesome. They're awesome. They're not necessarily supernatural, paranormal experiences, right? It's something more subtle than that. So not for a thrill seeker, but being human isn't, always about thrill seeking. So I think that there's a reason why the church does warn us, because if you want a spiritual experience, go take ayahuasca in a sweat lodge, right? It'll probably it could destroy your spiritual life forever, right? And that's why the church says don't do it. But with the Jesus prayer, we say, yeah, this is slower. But you will know God. And when you know God, you'll be ready for it. As much of yourself and the world as you can bear, right? Like we sing at the Transfiguration, rather than just some kind of, dramatic opening of the third eye or something like that.
Right. Yes.
So one last thing, do you have just a couple more minutes? Okay. So what about this idea of offering hesychasm as a part of our, I don't want to say outreach, but as part of our baptizing the culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that safe? Is that something that we need to do, like, depart all catechumens depart, where, no, this is sacramental, and it can hurt you if you're not actually part of the recognized church, the body of Christ. What do you reckon? Because just looking at it from the outside, the religious marketplace, hey,
Mm-hmm.
these meditation gyms are doing good for people. Can we provide that kind of a service?
I'm not sure what I think. I wonder about this. I do. As I noted earlier, the Way of the Pilgrim has been translated into lots of different language and enjoys this level of popularity while outside the church. If you look online, as I have recently, at Amazon, at books about the Jesus Prayer, about half of them are written by non-Orthodox. About half of them are written by other flavors of Christian. So it certainly is enjoying a level of popularity outside of, our liturgical life, specifically Orthodox liturgical life, for sure. I was reading, Frederica Matthews Green has a nice book, I think, about the Jesus Prayer, and I was reading it recently, and she comments about this. And her advice is something along the lines of, if you're going to pray the name of Jesus, this is a serious name to invoke. If you're going to invoke the divine name, it's hello dogs with gravitas. However, even for someone who is not, I think, and I hope I'm characterized Frederica Matthews here. If I'm not, it's my own fault, and I take full blame for it. But she has some sort of, willingness or openness that if someone is feeling called to and ready to call upon that name, call upon Jesus Christ with sincerity in their heart, that may be a way to find him, that may be a door through which they are then able to walk. And I thought that was really interesting. So I'm not sure what I think. I'm not sure what I think, because I do take very seriously, like I just kind of went through the different ways that these different authors and introducers of the hesychasm and the Jesus Prayer, advise us to be in companionship with someone as we do these practices and to be within the life of the church. I mean, I take that seriously. But on the other hand, I can see this possibility. I can see quite seriously the possibility of someone finding this prayer and in doing so, finding their way to Christ. That seems to me like that could quite possibly be true.
Right.
And be a wonderful thing.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't want to do it like away from the church necessarily, right? But the process of becoming a catechumen is giving your life to Christ, and in prayer, prayer certainly can be a part of this. So it need not be like communions, a sacramental action that's on the other side of formal membership. Because we ask the catechumen, have you united yourself to Christ? We don't say, do you, have you? You know, has this been part of your process of preparation? So now if you had, if you had someone who is, I don't know, atheist and says, "Oh, I'm really only here for the cookies," right? Yeah, I don't know. I still think that if they're part of a group, right, that may be the way that you introduce them, not just to the name of Jesus, right, and to the power and to knowing something greater than yourself in silence and community, but also how to relate to church, right? Because that relationship for many people is so polluted by misunderstanding that there's no way to have that conversation outside of a personal relationship with someone from the church. And that could be a way, like you were saying, it could be a way to introduce people. Just like, we're not afraid of introducing people to the church through, festivals, right? So, and some of the most effective outreach that I did as part of festivals was, church tours and talking about, how to know God through the life of the church, and, take them to icons and showing them how we do sacraments and things. This is something very real and very powerful. And it could be prefaced at the beginning, look, this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing, and then talk about it afterwards. I've done that with parishioners, and we put it on the schedule and on the website, that the chapel would be open for, I called it guided hesychasm, and all that meant was that I provided that, little short meditation at the beginning, and then, just sat there in silence. And then when we were done, when the time was up, brought them out, offered them a word, and told them they could stay as long as they want, right? And it wasn't like people were knocking down the doors. It wasn't a great outreach, but also it was also completely in line with the other things I do as a priest. It wasn't, it was within that normal distribution of things that the church does. So I think we could probably do more than we're actually doing, because this, to the extent that Christ is real and that a relationship with him is the key to human flourishing, and to the extent that prayer is a way to experience that, that's our business. That's what we're called to do. And I hope that this conversation, that's what we're offering, by the way, in this conversation, is, that this is a gift. This is a gift of God meant for his people, which is to say all of his people. If you have questions about it, feel free to contact me. father.anthony@yahoo.com is the best way. You can certainly find Dr. Carrie Frost, and she's a very busy person. She's homeschooling triplets. Did you understand that? That she's homeschooling triplets? You have to get up pretty early for your hesychasm, don't you?
I do get up early. It's one time the house is quiet. I need that exterior silence in order to promote the interior silence, just like the monastics.
Exactly. Yeah, and the rhythms of the house are such that you find when and where that is. And that's why, like I said, so much of my contemplation occurs when I'm walking or jogging. So, Kerry, any, we've been a lot of places. Do you anything you want to add here at the end as we wrap up?
No, I will share just a personal story, if that's okay.
Please.
I will share the story so I first read The Way of a Pilgrim the day that I turned 21. And I know this just because it was a very specific day. I was on a plane from Hong Kong to Copenhagen, and my mom had slipped it into my bag. So I would find it there, and I found it, and I read it on that plane flight. So I read it, and there's the line in there where the pilgrim finally finds his starets who's going to teach him how to pray unceasingly, right? And one of the things that the starret says to the pilgrim is everything comes from prayer. Some people think that good works come first, but no, actually everything comes from prayer, that you must learn to pray first, and from that, everything follows. And when I was 21, those words actually struck me really hard. They did. I felt like I knew plenty of people who did all kinds of good works and they weren't Christians, and that I felt like maybe this was wrong or disordered or something like that. And, I prayed at that age, but I still felt like those words they struck me, they rang wrong in my ears in some way, or rang harshly, I think. Maybe not wrong, but harshly. Okay, fast forward to this past spring, and I read The Way of the Pilgrim out loud to the triplets as well as their 17-year-old sister. We all sat around during COVID in the evenings, and we read the whole thing out loud together, which, by the way, they loved. My children loved it. They found it fascinating to a degree which I would not have predicted. So that was a real blessing for all of us. And when I read those words out loud to them, they just struck my heart in a completely different way. In my ears, they just rang so differently to me at this age, at this point in my life, age 47, totally differently. And, it's just, this is one of the beauties of encountering different things at different points in our lives and having different perspectives. And it's just become so important to me over my life to learn how to pray. Do I know how? No. I'm still a beginner. I'm still learning. But it's so critical to me as I work in the church, as I try to live a life of love, as I try to love people around me and to encounter my neighbor, as I try to live a life of hope in this world.
Beautiful. Yeah, see, these are the temptations that come when I try to practice hesychasm. So it's the dogs. Yeah, beautifully said, beautifully said. And just the punctuation on this. So one of the neat things, Kerry and I, we got to know each other in Charlottesville, but was a year and a half ago, we went to Romania. Is that right? Seems like a different world because it was pre-COVID, right? And the excuse to go on a pilgrimage to venerate the relics of Saint Paisi Velikovsky was, and she was very elaborate in her machinations, right? So she set up this conference, this international conference on theology, just so she could go and venerate the relics of Saint Paisi. But wasn't that just so awesome? Yeah, glory to God. All right, well, Kerry, thank you so much for offering your time and your, this experienced wisdom on Jesus' prayer, and God bless you and all of your service to your family, to your church. It is
Father Anthony,
awesome.
So good to see you. It's always so good to see you and be with you in any form.
Thank you. And I'm going to take you up. You said that you would be willing to talk to me about the variational responses to ritual in the church. So I'm going to take you up. See, I've got you now. This is like, I have witnesses.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm teasing you. Well, until next time, everybody, Godspeed.